Good morning to everyone and welcome to this side event on the role of foreign actors in the Middle East. There is indeed a general trend that we can witness since the fall of the wall in Berlin in the late 80s and also particularly since the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York in 2001. On the economic side, we witness an hegemony of an economic system taking place in the world of ultraliberalism and globalization, even though here and there, sometimes protectionist reflex come out again. Politically, the will of ancient colonial powers to maintain a sphere of influence, if not control over ancient colonies and beyond their territories, and also an attempt of superpower to impose itself as the guardian of the world, acting in the illegality and even with intention of weakening the international law system and the multilateral system. We also witness the creation, financing, and manipulation of non-state actors using violent means in order to destabilize or states structure in place. The result of that is a complete destruction of some countries. Physically, socially, we witness ethnic and religious division having been exacerbated, and also, of course, on the economic field. We also witness the emergence of a large number of armed groups that at the end of the day they are out of the control of their supporters, and also the worrying violations of fundamental freedoms and rights of the people everywhere, including in the Western countries, in the framework of the struggle against terrorism. And to go deeper inside to these issues, we have with us today three eminent panelists that I will introduce. First of all, Mr. Ahmed Al-Qarashi. He's a researcher and writer and a journalist. As a journalist, he has worked intensively in Iraq, Pakistan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Gulf region over the past 24 years. He is currently associated with an independent Islamabad-based think tank called Project Pakistan 21. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fattorini. So basically, we have another major transformation taking place in the Middle East. As if the region did not have enough, we have a new development, and it's a very interesting, different type of development. Whereas you had ISIS as the main vehicle of what I would call, in some ways, proxy warfare that destabilized the countries of the region. And ISIS, of course, has been decimated to a great extent now in Syria and Iraq. We are seeing different types of militias really taking place of ISIS or replacing ISIS. These militias are basically state-backed, and one country appears to be dominating this field, the field of using militias to further strategic interests of the state. That one country is Iran. Now, interestingly, Iran is not the only country that used proxy militias in the region. Of course, there are many countries of the region have been doing this. Qatar comes to mind. There are other Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia's name has been repeatedly mentioned. The United States. Many countries have been accused of using proxies. But frankly speaking, the scale of the Iranian project is breathtaking. It's something that the region has not really seen. The number of the militias that have been created, the diversity of the fighters, the scale, the scope of the operations of these militias across the region is unprecedented. And it's very, very successful. So basically, we've had ISIS, which played a key role in reshaping many countries in the region over the past few years, now being decimated and being replaced by, I would say, 60 plus large and small militias that are mainly backed by Iran. And it's a very successful experiment by the Iranian government, by the Iranian state, an experiment that no one has really done before. It's a new type of threat, and frankly, you can see the countries of the region are in a quandary, are confused. They are not sure exactly how to face this, because the Iranian project is not just simply creation of a militia and then recruiting people. The people, the fighters in the militias, are basically citizens of many of the countries of the region and are part of the fault lines within the countries of the region. So if the region and the countries of the region move against these militias, they will basically have to deal with the fault lines within their own countries. So it's a very complex situation, and frankly speaking, I know that many think tanks and many national intelligence agencies of many countries within and outside the region are studying the Iranian example. I'm quite sure that in a few years we will see the Iranian experiment with the use of proxy militias in the Middle East become part of the strategic studies curriculum in many universities. It's not happened yet, but I know that it's started. We are seeing, of course, many studies on this. So I'm going to basically explain a little bit this new phenomenon, how Iranian-backed militias are replacing ISIS as the main threat to the stability of the countries of the region. I'd like to begin with ISIS, and I just would like to just make a quick statement. ISIS offered the clearest example of how foreign actors can devastate a country, hijack domestic instability, and prolong a conflict. The terror group and its various mutations in different countries were an interesting example of the meeting of two minds. One is the international recruits, mainly based in Western countries, and the second was the local foot soldiers from the countries of the region. Now, I theorize that many of the most vile extremist ideas that we found within ISIS originated from communities of Muslim migrants in the West. I would dare to say that many of the worst ideas that ISIS fighters carried were actually theorized and formulated in Western countries where migrants used asylum laws. Some migrants, obviously, I'm not talking about all migrants. Some migrants from the Middle Eastern countries used asylum laws in the West and the freedoms to formulate and come up with extremist theories and then export them back to their home countries. And the foot soldiers on the ground in the Middle East, of course, embraced them. So you had ISIS creating a meeting ground between the theoreticians from some of the Western countries and foot soldiers on the ground in the Middle East. But now the development is, after the decimation of ISIS is almost gone, at least in Iraq and Syria. But the new development, of course, is the rise of the Iranian-backed militias with the. And this is very interesting. Iran-backed militias replace ISIS. This is a second theory that I would like to explain and talk about a little today. The Iran-backed militias replace ISIS as the second most potent example of foreign actors wreaking havoc across multiple countries of the region. Now, currently, Iran-backed militias are the dominating example of foreign actors reshaping key states in the Middle East. Of course, all of you have the examples: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. I'm going to offer another one, which is Afghanistan, and I'll explain it. But let me first say the Iranian experiment with armed militias as proxies for regional expansion began, of course, as you know, with Hezbollah. And of course, after that, they created small offshoots in many of the countries of the region. And one more example, and of course, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 was, of course, marked a major turning point. Why? Because some of the militias that Iran created that lay low, and I'll mention two, Al-Badr Brigade in Iraq, it's an Iraqi brigade, and there's the Dawa party. Both of these suddenly or indirectly entered into, I would say, contacts with the international coalition that invaded Iraq. And eventually, they became part of the process to create a replacement government to Saddam Hussein. And so in a way, Iran faced its first success when two of its main proxies became legitimate. They were legitimized by the international community when they became part of the process to create a new government in Iraq. And after that, and I would offer another example, which I'm sure many of us actually have overlooked, which is Afghanistan. It was a great success for Iran. Again, the Northern Alliance that defeated Taliban regime in Kabul in 2001 and took over, a lot of people forget it was a partially, heavily supported, trained, and funded also by Iran. Of course, there was Russia, there was India, and eventually, of course, in the end, there was the United States. But as a long-term project, it was Iran, it was Russia, and it was India that were funding the Northern Alliance. So basically, with the takeover of Kabul by the Northern Alliance, Iran actually had a very important foothold and continues to have that foothold in Afghanistan. It's a very low-key foothold. It's not really talked about. It's not like Lebanon where you have Hezbollah and it's a very open foothold. In Afghanistan, it's very low-key, and Afghanistan is a very strategically important place as well, but we'll discuss that later. I'll come back to the Middle East and what's going on here. Basically, I'd like to move on from this to another key point. When Hezbollah established itself in Lebanon, the process of creating chapters of Hezbollah across the region was very interesting. I, for example, grew up in Kuwait in the 1980s. We were just right next door. We had the Iran-Iraq War. I remember it was 1983, and I was after the morning assembly. We were going upstairs to our classrooms, and on the second floor, while going upstairs, we saw on the horizon a huge blast. And this was 1983, and the blast was at the French and the American embassies. And the perpetrators were basically the local Kuwait chapter of Hezbollah. Now, the Kuwaiti government was surprised. Nobody knew that there was Hezbollah here. And this was 1983, so 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. 4 years, it's a very short time to have such an organized cell working in a very closed country and a very secure country in a way, Kuwait. So basically, and they were, some of them were arrested and went to jail. They were not executed, to be released in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Of course, during the chaos, some of them ran. Some of them were part of Imad Mughniya cell of Hezbollah, who was, of course, assassinated later in Damascus. So basically, these small chapters were formed and were very lethal. For example, I just gave you the example of Kuwait, a small country. It was home at that time, by the way, to a very vibrant Palestinian community. The PLO had its first training camp in a suburb of Kuwait City called Hawali. And while the whole world actually focused on the presence of PLO and the fact that PLO senior leaders, including Yasser Arafat, traveling using Kuwaiti passports, and the whole focus was on that. But in reality, Hezbollah was doing a great job creating and strengthening a local Hezbollah cell. That cell went on later in 1987 to create the first violent incident during Hajj of 1987. I think about 16 Kuwaiti citizens who were part of Hezbollah, very well trained, were captured. Some of them were executed, some were, because they were underage, they were returned back to serve time in Kuwaiti jails. So basically, I mean, this is one example. Another example is Bahrain, for example. Bahrain had an issue, of course, about democracy and parliamentary rights and so forth, and the civil society has been very vibrant in Bahrain, and all of a sudden, after 1979, that civil society activism for freedoms and for parliamentary type of democracy and government and a constitutional monarchy transformed all of a sudden into something else. It was completely hijacked and captured by Hezbollah. And of course, you have Yemen, 16 or 18 years, Hezbollah grooming Houthi militias and training them and giving them theoretical training and actually militant training. So basically, Iran has this huge project across the region doing an impressive job. As I said, many countries use proxies. Almost every major country in the region does, but nobody has done it the way Iran has done it. I know that many countries, we talk to people from different countries, officials, they're studying the Iranian example. But there's one thing that Iran has done that really nobody can replicate. Nobody can replicate what Iran has done. What is that? Iran had an added advantage. The change of government in 1979 brought in the clergy, the clerics, the mullahs, the religious factor. So basically, what Iran has that no other country in the region using proxies does or have is the fact that Iran has the ability to recruit citizens, not of its own country, but citizens of other countries who are willing to fight to further Iranian strategic interests. And this is a strong element that I can't think really of any other country in the region or outside the region having the ability to create militias and have this a strong a factor to have fighters from diverse countries. I mean, for example, right now, the Iranian proxy project has fighters from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Bahrain, from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, definitely from other countries as well, probably. It's impressive. It's amazing. I saw some videos online where recruiters, professional recruiters for the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, visited some colleges and universities in Iran. And the students were making videos using their cell phones. So basically, the guards, the representatives come in, they go onto the stage, stand in front of the microphone, and somebody from the university faculty introduces the gentleman and says, they're here to talk about Syria, about the Iranian foreign policy and so forth. The purpose, of course, is to convince the students to and recruit talent into this whole project. And before even the gentleman starts talking, the student starts booing. And they start saying in Farsi, Iran first, we want our country first. As you saw recently in Iran protests as well, no Palestine, no Syria, Iran should be first and the focus should be on Iran and so forth. So Iranian officials basically face trouble recruiting Iranian talent to manage this huge strategic project that Iran is running across the region. And but Iran really did not have to worry. I can see IRGC officials really not very worried about this because I talked to, for example, some of the Afghan and some of the Pakistani recruits into the militias, the Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun who went to Syria, and they were very committed. They were convinced by what they were doing, and I offered them a theory. I said, what if you're just being used to further the strategic interest of a country, in this case Iran? I mean, this is not a religious thing. And they were so convinced they were not really willing to entertain this idea that they are fighting to further the strategic interest of a certain government and a certain type of government that has a certain agenda. So this is very interesting. This is a point of strength that Iran has that no other country in the region does. So this is a very strong thing that Iran has, and I can see right now, if there are many countries in the region that are worried about the Iranian militias, they want to counter those Iranian militias. But the problem is, if you go and counter these militias, you enter into a different thing. You enter into a sectarian debate. And if you clamp down on them, you raise the specter of clamping down on your own Shia citizens, and that again then used as a tool, as a propaganda to say, wow, see, for example, country X is clamping down on its Muslim Shia citizens without, of course, saying that, why the country is doing that. The country is doing it because they're part of a militia that is working for another country. But the very fact that they're citizens of X country and they are from a minority sect, that's ground enough to become propaganda. So basically, it's an amazing project, frankly. Even as a researcher myself, studying this project, it's impressive. I mean, we've seen how the United States used proxies in Libya. We've seen, of course, multiple countries using proxies in Syria. But the scale of the Iranian project is impressive, is amazing, is very difficult to be countered. I am yet to see a solution being offered by any country really to end this. Because if you're going to, and I'll conclude with this point, if you're going to convince the fighters of multiple countries that are part of these militias to end fighting and go back to their countries, I fail to see how you're going to do this, because Iran is using the religious factor, and that is very hard, really, to how to clean, I mean, these people, to cleanse these fighters. It'll be very difficult. So it's a major transformation. It's undergoing, and let's see how it ends. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your presentation, and particularly for having highlighted the role of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the region, which reminds also us the issue of use of mercenaries and the consequences on the right to self-determination of the peoples. And now I will pass the floor to Dr. Tarek Chindeb, is Professor of International Criminal Law, lawyer since 1999, member of the Council Directors of the International Union of Jurists. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you.
شكرا. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Ahmed Quraishi for his presentation, and in fact it was a very great presentation. I do agree with him in a lot of the points he raised, and this makes us understand that the violations of Iran and the Middle East have extended to touch all countries in the region and to affect them. We have also to confirm that the flagrant Iranian interventions in the region in support of terror and its work to destabilize societies through instilling sectarianism and extremism, which Iran established in our Arab countries and nurtured. This is a danger or a threat that requires to be confronted, especially as these organizations have become challenging or defying the legitimate governments and hijacking their decisions and sovereignty, and they are killing without any kind of responsibility. Iraq, for example, is under the control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the sectarian Iranian militias that are controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. In Yemen, Iran has stricken the Yemeni society through the Houthis and used Yemen as a platform to send messages to other Arab countries in the region through sending ballistic missiles against neighboring Arab countries. Maybe the report of the panel of experts of the United Nations responsible for Yemen, assigned under the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2213, was obvious. The report was presented a month ago in January, and it confirms that Iran has used the Yemeni Houthi militias to wage attacks against Arab countries, and that missiles and arms used by these militias were Iranian-made and provided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and that Houthi militias are destabilizing the GCC region. Maybe the Syrian example is the issue of the hour, and it is the more painful and bleeding example in the region, and I'll stop by it. As we see in Syria, there are interventions and interference by external parties. As I'm speaking to you now, children and women of Al-Ghouta are being killed because of the Russian aerial bombardment and the bombardment from the Syrian regime army. And yesterday, the Syrian regime and the Russian fighters used the Syrian gas against the eastern Ghouta to Damascus. It has been 7 years since the Syrian revolution. And these 7 difficult years, so suffering of the Syrian people, killing, terrorism, displacement, and the crimes committed by the Syrian regime, to the extent that international human rights organizations classified the Syrian prisons as being human slaughterhouses. And Human Rights Watch report published about Sidnaya prison is confirming what I say. And the reports of international human rights organizations of different affiliations confirm that the Syrian regime is killing its people not only since 7 years, but since more than 40 years ago. However, what happened in these past 7 years was something that is unimaginable by any mind or any person. We can refer to the reports of the international commissions of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council. The latest report was presented 3 days ago, and the committee is established by the UN Security Council and the Organization on Banning the Chemical Weapons, which confirm that the Syrian regime is using chemical weapons and chlorine gas, as well as other banned weapons against its own people. And these violations that were committed against the Syrian people were associated with different forms of foreign interventions, and I'll stop by them subsequently. The first intervention was, or interference, was the Iranian militias' interference in these crimes. Al-Khamenei, who is the spiritual leader of Iran, sent Iranian militias and Iraqi militias to serve the regime of Bashar al-Assad when the regime was about to collapse. And all the leaders of the Iranian regime, they confess to that. They confirm that they are the ones protecting this regime of Syria, and that they sent thousands of fighters, Shia and sectarian fighters, to slaughter the Syrian people. And this is something that is evidenced, confirmed, and it does not need any evidence. We see on TV the crimes that are committed by these militias, and this is a small fraction of what they do on the ground. Sadly, these sectarian militias with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces contributed to worst massacres in Syria, the killing, slaughtering, and displacement of people, and all these are crimes of war and crimes against humanity, and there is ethnic cleansing in different parts of Syria. Number 2, the second interference or intervention was Hezbollah Lebanese militias intervention, who intervened by a request from Iran, and the number of Hezbollah fighters in Syria reached up to 30,000 fighters, and these fighters entered Syria since 7 years ago, and they killed the Syrian people. They participate with the Syrian regime in slaughtering the Syrian people without any kind of condemnation or holding them accountable or liable for what they do. The third form of interventions is the role of Russia. Russia played a fundamental role in supporting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and this role was not only the political support in the Security Council. They have used the veto 11 times to prevent the referral of the Syrian file to the ICC, but they have also provided the military support in terms of the air power and the navy, as well as the land troops. And Syria is a culprit in the killing and genocide in Syria and the crimes against humanity. We should not forget that there are 11 million Syrians who are displaced today, and that about 1 million Syrians have died because of the aerial bombardment and killing on the ground, and there are about 300,000 detainees whose fate is unknown. some may question about the role of the so-called terrorist groups or organizations. Before I talk about terrorist organizations, I have to emphasize on the resolution 2401 from the Security Council, which confirms that the military intervention of Russia should stop, but the Syrians are neglecting that resolution and they are bombarding different parts of Syria, and Putin said that he will stop for 5 hours every day for the exit of children and the delivery of aid. Despite that, this truce was not, or this lull was not enforced, and this confirms that the Russians are having the upper hand in the killing that is taking place in Syria. Fourth intervention is the role of the terrorist organizations and groups such as Al-Qaeda and IS and their role in human rights violations in Syria. We know that the so-called IS was created after the Syrian revolution. Before that, there wasn't any IS or ISIL. When the Syrian regime was about to collapse, they have established ISIL. Why? Because ISIL is fighting on behalf of the Syrian regime. It's a proxy war. Some may not believe that, but this is the truth. In all regions that were occupied by Daesh or ISIL, they were taken from the Syrian rebels, and then they were handed over easily to the Syrian regime, and this is confirmed. We have seen the exchanges between ISIL and Hezbollah, and the agreement in Lebanon, the agreement in Mosul and Raqqa. All these agreements evidence that ISIL is the product of Bashar al-Assad regime and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and they have used it in these areas in order to serve that regime and to mislead the world and to say it that they are fighting against terror. ISIL has committed violations and terror, videotaped everything and terrified the world, and then it was used by the Syrian regime and Iran to give themselves the legitimacy to slaughter the Syrian people. I stand here by what was said yesterday by the High Commissioner in his annual report. He said that the widespread violations committed by the Syrian government and its local allies starting from 2011 created the space for the breeding and nurture of extremist groups, and he added the recent attempts to justify the indiscriminate and brutal attacks against hundreds of thousands of civilians, and saying that this is necessity to combat hundreds of terrorists, such as what is happening in eastern Ghouta, cannot sustain morally and in terms of prosecutions. He also added that when a person is ready to kill his own people, it's easy to lie. This statement is very beautiful. When a person is ready to kill his own people, it's very easy for him to lie. And the High Commissioner adds that the allegations of the Syrian government that it takes all precautions to protect civilians is ridiculous. He concluded as such. So I conclude here to say that the lie of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, which was created by Bashar al-Assad regime and used by it in the US and in Lebanon and in Syria, they use in Iraq, is a lie that is uncovered now. And all these militias, they have slaughtered the Syrian people. They are criminals, and they were created for the aim of protecting that terrorist regime that is killing its people with the facilitation from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The crimes against humanity and the war crimes and genocide crimes committed by the Syrian regime, which were done with involvement of the Iranian militias that are exceeding 60,000 elements, are crimes crimes that are not time barred, and there should be international actions to prosecute the criminals and those behind them. Not prosecuting these criminals and those who committed other crimes against the people of the Middle East will encourage more killing in the region, and the systemic killing will continue, and more crimes will happen in the future, and therefore these militias should be prosecuted, starting from the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, ending with the regime of Bashar al-Assad and ISIL, in order to achieve justice and in order to protect the values of the international humanitarian law. The terror coming from Iran to the Arab region came after the Iranian revolution, after 79, and then they have exported the so-called the revolution, but in fact they have exported terror, and this terror is based on the occupation of Arab states, undermining the Arab states, and now the Iranian officials are boasting that they have seized control of 5 Arab capitals through ISIL, through the Revolutionary Guards, the sectarian militias, and Hezbollah militias. If we want to talk about the crimes of Hezbollah terrorist militias and Iran militias against the Syrian and the Lebanese people, we require days, or probably months. My friend, he highlighted some small things, but all this is a small fraction of what is happening. All the terror you see in the world is a product of this Iranian Revolutionary Guards who want to serve their own idea, which is the Wali al-Faqih regime and the exportation of the revolution. And the problem is that they cover this with a religious notion. They say that religion orders them to do that, but it isn't. In fact, they want to lie to the people and mislead the people. This is the situation in the Middle East, and we have to be frank. And the international justice is at stake, and the impunity should be over, and there should be international pressure to prosecute all these criminals to the ICC or to the special tribunals in order to build a safer future for us and our people. Thank you.
I thank you, Professor, your presentation and for having highlighted the role of the international and regional powers in all these fighting going on in many countries, and of course also the consequences, the war crimes and crimes against humanity for which everyone should account one day. And now I give the floor, we have only 12 minutes left, to Mr. Bahara Shiban, human rights defender who investigates autonomous weapons systems strikes in Yemen, and have testified in the US Congress on the effect of these systems on the program on local communities. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here to share some of the, I think, observations and findings that I think many people have been witnessing for a long time. But only when we put everything in the context together, we start to have a clear idea about the real threat to what we consider is happening in the region. As Mr. Qureshi said and Mr. Shandab mentioned quite clearly, the using of proxies in foreign states and the level that you can use foreign citizens and the ability of your ability to recruit foreign citizens to advance your own agenda. Today I'll be focusing on the situation in Yemen, and I'll explain in as much detail as I can in the time limit I have what is the effect of such a project, the Iranian project, inside Yemen. A clear case study, a clear example of what has been happening in Yemen since 80s and 90s, and then reaching to the situation where we are today, a civil war that doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Interestingly enough, when we start tracing back the origins of the Houthi movement, the Houthis started as a small religious group teaching Islamic teachings, religious teachings in small schools, madrasas, in the northern part of the country. They did benefit to a high level from the fact that the central government kept weak and not being able to deliver active services to many communities. Literally, what was Mr. Qureshi mentioning, minorities, people feeling marginalized, people feeling they're away from the decision-making process at the national level. Interestingly enough, Hussein Al-Houthi, the founder of the Houthi movement, visited Iran in 1985. And that was only 6 years, maybe, just after the beginning of the Iranian Revolution. Interestingly enough, also, he considered actually joining the Badr Brigade to fight Saddam Hussein in 1985. Now, believe it or not, I didn't bring this information from any source other than Al-Manar TV channel, the TV channel that belongs to Hezbollah. In the channel website, you're going to see as source when you try to search the page on Hussein Al-Houthi that he considered joining the Badr Brigade in 1985 to fight Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government back in the 80s. And the level is quite amazing that actually they can convince a foreign citizen that they can be part of their brigade to fight an Arab country. That movement then continued teaching and enhancing their representation in the ground until the situation in the northern part of the country, in Sada province, became unbearable, that the members of the Houthi movements became very confrontational to their neighboring communities until clashes finally erupted in 2004. The situation remained with the Houthi movement between 2004 until 2009, with 6 times fighting the Yemeni state. Interestingly enough, what both speakers mentioned, using proxies that can exhaust the state, that can keep exhausting the state, and actually working on a long-term level. This is not the short-term level. That doesn't mean they're going to achieve the collapse of a regime or collapse of governments and national states in a year or two, but can actually extend to 10 years or maybe 15 years. The Yemeni society witnessed, and again, this is again how the Iranian regime using, I think this policy is quite effective in many areas, is that you cannot at the beginning you only can see small traces of how the Iranians are involved in the region. Only when in the situation in Yemen, when the Houthis took control over the capital Sana'a in September 2014, the Iranians came out clear that they are supportive of the coup in 2014 and started opening flights for the first time between Sana'a and Tehran. And that's quite another thing, that the level how the Iranian regime is willing to go with its proxies. You have a sovereign state, an official state, that's the Iranian government, signing a treaty with a militia in a different country that they are going to start flights between those two countries. To put it all together quickly into context, Yemen following the Arab Spring had a transitional period. In that transitional period, we had the national dialogue with all factions of the society participating in the talks and the discussions until we came up with the draft constitution. That draft constitution was with the participation of everyone, including the Houthis themselves. However, in 2014, the Security Council had a meeting following the national dialogue meetings and concessions inside Sana'a to issue the resolution number 2140, And the main aim of this resolution is to neutralize all states from intervening into the Yemeni affairs to ensure the success of the transitional period. However, the same resolution is the resolution that found the UN panel of experts whose main role is to identify not just individuals and entities who are going to intervene or obstruct the transitional period inside Yemen. The panel of experts, the UN panel of experts report since 2015 started tracing clearly about the role of Iran inside the country. And I'm going to here give quick examples of what was mentioned. Interestingly enough, the report, I'm going to quickly just refer back to the latest report. Although in the January 2017 report, it mentions Iran 75 times. This year's report, which was just came out in January 2018, as Mr. Shanda mentioned just a month ago, it mentioned Iran 111 times. And I'm going to quickly quote some of the paragraphs mentioned by the UN panel of experts report. It says, the panel has identified missile remnants, related military equipment, and military unmanned aerial vehicles that are of Iranian origin and were brought into Yemen after the imposition of the targeted arms embargo. As a result, the panel finds that the Islamic Republic of Iran is non-compliant with paragraph 14 of the resolution 2216. It also mentions that Iran has provided short-range ballistic missiles, field storage tanks for liquid, oxidizers for missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles to the Houthi and Saleh alliance. In paragraph 62 of the same report, it says Iran has provided advisors to the Houthis. And this is again how the Iranian regime starts creating small militias that then extends and starts growing in numbers. When I was in Yemen, still part of the national dialogue, it was quite telling that actually we were witnessing a form of a mini Hezbollah being formed at the north of the country, doing parades, chanting the same Iranian slogans, repeating many of the chants and messages of the Iranian Revolution. Although we are thousands of miles away from Iran, we don't share a border with Iran, and it was quite telling what would Iran want from this group up in the north of the country. Going forward in the same report, in paragraph 79, for example, the panel says it has now identified strong indicators of the supply of arms-related material manufactured in or emanating from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Again, Iran has not been compliant with the embargo which was imposed on Yemen on 14th of April 2015. Paragraph 94 also says that it has traced, and it clearly mentions two components were manufactured in the Islamic Republic of Iran, two components of the missiles. One of them had Farsi labeling adding into it. Another, it goes on. In paragraph 99, the panel finds that the medium-sized Qasif-1 unmanned aerial vehicle is virtually identical in design, dimensions, and capability of that Ababil T, which was manufactured by the Iran Airfact manufacturing industries. And it still goes on. In section E, for example, paragraph 1, Iranian manufactured bottom sea mines, 111. The United Arab Emirates reported the discovery of at least 3 sea mines in the ports of Mocha in the panel. The recovered sea mines are consistent in shape and size to the Iranian manufactured bottom sea mine. It goes on. In section F, paragraph 115, in this report, the panel reports the seizure and operational use of anti-tank guided missile which characteristics very similar to that of the Iranian-manufactured Delavi. And it goes on and on to the use of unarmed anti-tank missiles, short ballistic missiles. In short, we have a group that started with small recruiting forms, started with providing, getting advisors to grow in number, grow in tactic, until they eventually were able to exhaust the state, the Yemeni state, staging the coup, making the country enter into a civil war. And exactly like Mr. Qureshi mentioned, is that the danger becomes that you cannot then clamp down on your own citizens, because then you'll be accused of targeting minorities and minority groups inside the country. And as soon as they take power or they become in a place of strength, the amount of then of weaponry support and material support quite increases. Then it becomes impossible for the state itself to cope with the strength of the militia. Today in Yemen, we have a militia that is in fact stronger than all of the components, even if they are still a minority. I think I'll stop here, and I'll leave it for the Q&A. Thank you.
I thank you. I'm sorry for shortening your presentation, which is very interesting, and I thank you for sharing many informations about the actual situation in Yemen. Unfortunately, time is up. We have to leave the room and let our colleagues that will host another side event. But we can, maybe you can interact with the panelists outside. There is some sandwiches and beverages. Thank you very much for your attention. I thank you, the panelists and the interpreters. Thank you very much.